Yes!
I'll never forget when I first obtained the exotic hand cannon Thorn back in Destiny 1 and how utterly confused I was when I used it for the first time. It was classified as a kinetic weapon, but it dealt damage over time. So I figured that it might have had a perk that enabled it to deal solar damage or something, because in my mind, the damage over time was reminiscent of burn damage. But it turned to find out that Thorn was indeed a kinetic damage weapon and didn't have any actual elemental capabilities at all. The poison effect was an attribute exclusive to it. Keep in mind that this was back in year 1 of D1, and like many other players, I was fairly new to the game and was still learning the how-tos of it. Fast forward to year 2 of Destiny 2. Thorn made its return as a kinetic weapon, something not surprising at all, because in spite of the energy kinetic weapon slot split, Thorn was still very much considered to be a kinetic damage weapon, and its poisoning effects have zero correlation to solar arc or void damage, so placing it in an energy slot would have made no sense at all. But things started to get weird when, in Season 11, the breech-loaded exotic grenade launcher Witherhoard stepped onto the scene. This weapon was also thrown into the kinetic slot. If you've ever used Witherhoard, you would know that there's nothing kinetic about it at all. Instead of explosive munitions, this weapon fires literal taken energy. Witherhoard's kinetic slot placement is similar to Thorn's, but at least Thorn actually fires tangible rounds. There's nothing kinetic about the Witherhoard at all. But anyways, I eventually moved on about my life instead of racking my brain even more. From the Season 14 pass, we were given the exotic stasis damage sidearm, Crysthesia 77K. And guess what? This weapon belongs to the kinetic slot. Now, at this point in time, my annoyance and confusion got the best of me because I could not wrap my head around why Bungie kept throwing non-kinetic damage weapons into the kinetic slot. There had to be a logical reason behind this, so I decided to figure things out on my own. I'll go ahead and share what I figured out. Now, I want y'all to know that there is a difference between elements and energy. Turns to find out that the words energy and elemental aren't interchangeable at all. Well, they pretty much were until it was announced that we'll be getting darkness-based subclasses. Since the very beginning, we've had access to the elements of solar arc and void. And in PvE activities, you would encounter enemies with solar arc and void shields, and if you afflict their shields with the corresponding element, their shield will break. Now, this is the only real superlative energy weapons have ever had over kinetic weapons, and this reason alone is why energy weapons were held to a much higher regard in PvE over kinetic weapons in Destiny 1. There was no kinetic and energy slot split in D1 like there is in D2, and energy and kinetic weapons shared what was known as the primary slot. A split in kinetic and energy weapons between two separate slots was a decision made to encourage usage of kinetic and energy weapons simultaneously instead of having to decide between one or the other like the D1 days. Okay, now this is where the logic comes into play. I'm quoting this directly from an older video of mine, but in that video, I stated that the darkness represents the absence of energy, whereas the light elements represents the presence of energy. Another thing I learned is that the sensation of cold doesn't actually exist in the most literal sense, because when you're feeling cold, it's actually due to the absence of heat. Stasis is also the literal antithesis of solar light in the sense that fire is the opposite of ice, but I'm pretty sure you already know this. I hope that made sense, but by technicality, Thorn, Witherhoard, and Crysthesia may not be kinetic damage weapons, but they aren't energy-based weapons either, because, once again, darkness represents the absence of energy, and as of presently, stasis shields don't exist in the game, so there would be absolutely no point of stasis weapons that exist in the energy slot. It's not a secret at all that we'll be getting 2 additional darkness-based subclasses aside from stasis, and it's rumored that the next one will be referred to as corruption. If the rumors are anything to go by, this darkness element will revolve around damage over time and wither an opponent's will completely away. If we end up getting corruption-based subclasses, it's not a secret at all that Thorn will have its kinetic damage classification replaced with corruption. I don't know if the ability to wield the taken energy is something that we'll ever have access to, but if that were to happen, Witherhoard would finally receive its correct elemental classification as well. Once again, even though Thorn, Crysthesia, and Witherhoard aren't actually kinetic damage weapons, they lack energy-based capabilities. The same can be said about the Outbreak Perfected. Outbreak isn't a darkness-based weapon, despite the fact that Siva is a parasitic life form, effectively making it bad, but just because something is bad and or evil doesn't mean that it's aligned with the darkness. Outbreak Perfected fires Siva nanites, something that I don't think should qualify as kinetic ammunition, but this definitely is not an example of an energy-based weapon either. I didn't really think about this in so much depth before, but I'm pretty sure that there'll be a point in time where the kinetic slot receives an entirely new name. Also, the word kinetic indicates that this slot is the home of weapons only capable of firing ballistic ammunition, with no elemental-based attributes, and that's nowhere near the case anymore. This slot needs more love anyways, because for the longest, the energy slot has been the most oversaturated of the 3 slots. Keep in mind that all primary and special weapon types can exist here. The only kinetic fusion and linear fusion rifles are the Arbalest and Bastion, and these weapons are not conventional members of their respective weapon families. Bungie had to get very creative when it came to designing these weapons because regular fusions and linear fusions are energy based. This is why Arbalest and Bastion absolutely had to be of the exotic rarity. And because of the very special case of uniqueness of both of these weapons, I doubt that we'll ever see kinetic fusion and linear fusion rifles of the legendary rarity. The kinetic slot has always been more restricted regarding what weapons are allowed to exist there, so it always seemed as if there's less kinetic weapons in the game in comparison to energy weapons. I always wanted to see more weapons exist in the kinetic slot, and every time a new kinetic weapon releases, I'm eager to try it out. I think it's pretty creative that Bungie was able to find a loophole around things by introducing elemental weapons to this slot that don't count as energy weapons at the same time. Now, I would never rule out the possibility of enemies possessing stasis or even corruption-based shields in PvE, but based on the way that Bungie wants darkness to be represented in the franchise, I personally believe that Solar Arc and Void will remain as the only shield types in PvE. Well, everybody, that does it for this one. Hopefully, this provided some much needed clarity as to why darkness-esque weapons exist in the kinetic slot. I'm looking forward to more darkness-based weapons making their way into the game, and I'm even more excited to see how effective they'll be overall. But yeah, if you made it to the end of this video and enjoyed what you watched, do me a favor and thumb rush that like button until it turns blue. And if you're new to my neck of the woods, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and click that bell icon so you don't ever miss a video of the most elite gaming content. But with that being stated, 1LHD is over and out. Y'all take it easy.
Can redeem you and me. Don't you wanna feel something? And oh, I miss loving you, but I need to live my own truth. I wanna feel it all brand new. I found a little something from Miss Angelou. Take the good and hold it near to you, and let go of all that burdens you.